What's going on, guys? It's New York Prepper here. Just wanted to do a video about stealthiness and the importance of being stealthy after an SHTF situation. I think this is a very overlooked and underestimated part of prepping, I think stealthiness is the most important skill to have after an SHTF situation. Whether you're going to be bugging out to get to your bug out location, or if you're going to be trying to escape from a urban area, if you work or you live in an urban area and you need to escape, you're going to need to be stealthy in order to, not draw any attention to yourself and avoid trouble. So, you need specific types of gear in order to be stealthy, and it's not just about the gear. Also, it's about your tactics and the way you move. It's more than just gear. It's more than just camouflage. It's a mindset. And I think a lot of people, a lot of preppers are very well knowledgeable about the gray man philosophy, which, if you don't know what that is, it basically means that if you're bugging out somewhere or you're trying to escape, from an urban area or something like that, where there's a lot of other people around, the gray man philosophy basically says that you should try to blend in with the people around you, and you don't really want to stand out too much, because then you can draw attention to yourself, which could create a security risk. People may try to take your stuff. If, let's say, you have a backpack or survival gear, if people see that you're prepared, they may target you to take your gear, to take your food, your supplies, whatever the situation is. That's what they call a gray man. And gray man and stealth are two different things, and I just kind of wanted to explain the differences and then get more into detail about being stealthy after SHTF. So the gray man philosophy is more about, in the early stages of SHTF, or if it's if you're in an urban area and you're amongst people and it's broad daylight, you don't want to be running around with camouflage and, a big chest rig with, all kinds of gear on you, because it's going to draw attention to you by, people are going to see you, law enforcement is going to see you, and depending on what type of SHTF situation it is, you could even be detained and questioned, if you have camouflage and, all kinds of different gear on you. You may be searched, to see if you have any weapons. So the gray man philosophy works very well in the initial stages of SHTF in order for you to get away from a heavily populated area, especially if you work in an area like that, or if you live in a very heavily populated area. The gray man philosophy will help you to get away in the initial stages of SHTF, but it's not going to get you all the way home or all the way to your bug out location. At some point, you're going to have to transition from gray man to stealthiness, and stealthiness involves the use of more traditional military style, tactics of camouflaging, which would be like face paint, face mask, camouflage, coloring, even the use of ghillie suits, or using vegetation, attaching vegetation to your gear in order to blend in, things like that. That's what you want to use after you have already kind of cleared, the urban area, let's say, and then once you're starting to get further away from the city or further away from the population center, then you can comfortably transition into a more full-scale stealth tactics and stealthy gear, which will help you to avoid trouble, and it doesn't matter who you are, what kind of weapons you have, what kind of training you have, what kind of experiences you've had. It's always better to avoid conflict than to, have to deal with conflict. anytime you have to deal with an aggressive person, there's always a chance that you can get hurt. There's a chance that you can draw more attention to yourself from, other people around the area. So you want to avoid confrontation as much as possible. If you're escaping from a city, let's say, for example, you work in downtown New York City or downtown Los Angeles, downtown Boston, and you have a house, somewhere on the outskirts, or you have a bug out location somewhere on the outskirts, or you have a rendezvous point where you're going to meet people on the outskirts. In the initial stages of SHTF, if let's say there's another 9/11 or something like that, and you know that you have to get home, and the only way to get home is to get home on foot. Your car's not gonna get you that far because everything's gonna be clogged up. The roads are gonna be backed up. You may even be targeted by criminals. So you may have to leave on foot, and that's where, in those initial stages, is where the gray man philosophy will work, because you're going to want to kind of blend in with all the other people. You're going to kind of want to look like you're the average Joe. You don't want to look like you're, a tactical person, or, trained or experienced or anything like that. You kind of just want to look like everyone else, and then once you get past, the main city area, and you start getting further out, where it's a little more suburban or it's a little more spread out, then you can implement more, stealth tactics, and you can really go a little more hardcore with the camouflage and stuff like that. Especially as time goes on, there's going to be more risk of people attacking you, because they're going to start getting thirsty, they're going to start getting hungry. There's going to be criminals who are going to take advantage of the fact that there's no power and there's no police services, and the police are overwhelmed, so they're going to target people. So stealth is going to be good at once you get past that point, when you're away from people, especially after dark. Once it gets dark and it's nighttime, depending on what time the SHTF situation hits, you can really implement the stealth tactics, which you don't really have to go too crazy. But the main thing that I would say is, depending on the time of the year, you should select clothing that's, going to match your terrain. The colors should match the terrain, and the time of the year as well. So if, let's say, you have green colors for the summer, and then in the winter you should have more brown colors, because if you have green and you run into the forest in the fall or in the winter, you're going to stand out with that bright green color, because all the leaves are brown and everything's brown. So the best thing, in my opinion, is to have earthy colored clothing, and try to avoid camouflage, especially if it's a get home situation. But also if you're bugging out and you have to bug out through an urban area or more population area, the earthy colors will still give you a certain degree of camouflage, but it won't draw attention to you during daylight hours. If you have to cross through, a more urban area, you're going to kind of get away with it a little more than if, you had full-scale camouflage, and, if you had, some like, typical camouflage pattern clothing on you, and face paint and everything else, and a ghillie suit, you're going to stand out. So, but even with earthy color clothes, you can augment your camouflage with earthy color clothes. You can take branches and try to attach them to your backpack. If you have molly webbing, you can attach, branches in the local area. You can cut them off and just stick them in. You can do a lot of different things to break up your outline. And stealth is more than just camouflage. Stealth involves picking out concealment and using concealment to your advantage. And when you're moving through an area, you're not just kind of moving without any purpose. If you're trying to be stealthy, you're picking very methodical. You're very methodical with every movement that you make. So if you know that you have to go another 20 or 30 miles to get to where you need to be, and you have to cross through a fairly populated area, or even if it's a secluded area, as you're moving, you're going to want to move between different areas of concealment. You know, you want to stay away from like open areas where you can be easily observed, especially as SHTF, as time goes on, you know, it's going to get more and more dangerous, especially in more populated areas, but even in secluded areas and in rural areas too. You know, you have to always have your guard up, and you have to always kind of treat, like, in the back of your mind, like, oh, somebody's always watching you and that you're constantly under observation. You know, you should always have that, like, if you're moving through an area, you should always have in the back of your mind that you're under observation, that somebody's watching you, you know, that people are, you know, looking for you or tracking you. You know, another thing is counter tracking, which is a whole separate video, but you should also implement some counter tracking tactics, which it's a lot of stuff to get into. I don't have enough time right now to do that, but you know, counter tracking also works with stealth, because you don't want to leave traces of that you went through an area. You know, you don't want people to know that you were camped out somewhere, or that, you know, you don't want people to be able to pick up your tracks and follow you easily. So that's a whole nother thing in itself, and knowing how to move through an area to avoid leaving a lot of tracks and a lot of spoor, you know, where somebody can track you. But for the average Joe, you know, most bad guys are not expert trackers and expert woodsmen. You know, most bad guys are going to look for obvious things like footprints, you know, food wrappers, you know, ammunition, shells, things like that. So as long as you keep your campsite clean, and you don't, you know, aren't extremely sloppy with how you're traveling, you know, don't walk through muddy areas, you know, don't walk through areas that are going to leave your footprints behind. Try to stick to harder surfaces. But you know, with stealth, as you're moving through, if it's a bug out situation or, you know, a get home situation, you should always pick, you know, one spot of concealment and then move to another spot of concealment as much as you can. You know, obviously that's not always easy to do, especially in an urban environment where you have open streets and things like that. But if you're in an urban environment, you may want to try to stick to, like, you know, alleyways and maybe areas that are more off the beaten path. You know, train tracks are a good one. You know, almost every city has train tracks that go through the city and lead to the suburbs on the outside. And the train tracks are often, they may have some like bushes around them. They're oftentimes like more wooded, and that can give you a little bit of concealment rather than walking right down Main Street, you know, in the middle of the open. But, you know, another thing is if the power is out, you know, the cities are going to go dark, so you're not going to have to worry about street lights. You know, street lights are going to be gone. So that'll give you a lot of that'll assist you in being able to evacuate and get out as quickly and safely as possible. And then again, picking the right clothing is essential, because if you're moving through somewhere and it's nighttime and you have bright clothing, you have like a white shirt, you know, and bright clothing that's going to stand out at night, you know. So you want to have darker colors, earth colors, you know, browns, dark greens, blacks even. You want to have those types of colors, you know, your backpack, your pants, your shirt. And you want to also cover up your skin, you know, because your skin it'll also, you know, give away your position. So you want to cover that up either with a face mask or you know, face paint. You know, like here I have just a basic face mask. This thing cost me like $10. I keep it in my bug out bag. And then I have you know, I have this wool shirt. This is a dark green wool shirt, and as you see, it doesn't look suspicious at all. I can wear this in the middle of the city, and this will also camouflage me if I'm out in the woods somewhere. You know, it doesn't really look like camouflage, but it works really well. And then another thing too is your seasons. Like I said, you have to have the right color clothing and the right camouflage gear and to maintain stealth depending on the season. And that's the one area that a lot of preppers overlook, and that's you know, the winter time. You know, because if there's snow on the ground and you have, you know, like a green shirt like this, And if I'm moving through a snowy area, and it could be like an open hardwood forest where there's just nothing but, open hardwoods and, snow everywhere. If I'm wearing these earthy clothes, you're going to see me from a mile away. Anybody can see that from a long distance. So you need to have some kind of camouflage for the proper for the season. And here I just have a white snow poncho that goes over my clothes, and I can wear it over my gear, and it's going to make me blend in with the snow. So always have to choose the right gear for the season. And then here's like one of my bug out bags, which you guys may have seen. This is a Maxpedition Condor 2. This is a green color. So that's just an example. So you always want to move with concealment. You want to use concealment, and you want to also reduce your footprints and the ability for somebody to track you. And you want to avoid conflicts as much as possible. Avoid people. Stick to off the beaten routes to move. Like, you want to stay to like railroad tracks are good. Stay away from any main highways, main popular hiking trails or popular roads. You want to stay away from those areas because that's where everybody's going to be going, and then criminals are going to be setting up ambushes in those areas because the criminals are going to need resources too, so they're going to be looking for people. With the stealth, in addition to using concealment, you should also maintain good discipline when it comes to using your light. A simple click of the flashlight can be seen from a mile away, especially when everything is pitch dark outside and there's no power. You can see a little flashlight from, a long distance. So avoid using your flashlight, avoid smoking cigarettes, avoid any kind of smells. If you got to build a campfire, there's ways to build a campfire so you don't have a huge flame and like a big visual and a smell, that's going to be seen or smelled from a long distance. You can dig a Dakota fire pit. There's a lot of different things that you can do, but it's up to you guys to do the research on all these things. I already know all these things, but it's up to you guys to think about it and see what you need to do, and think about, what areas you need to expand your knowledge in and practice, your stealth skills. Also you have to know how to move and be quiet when you're walking. You have to have some ability to step lightly so you don't make a ton of noise when you're walking, because footsteps can be heard from long distances, especially in the forest when the leaves are dry. You can hear somebody moving from hundreds of yards away. So these are all things to think about. Yeah, so I can really spend the whole night here talking about, how to be stealthy, but it's really up to you guys to figure out, how it's going to work for you. And another important thing too is to avoid silhouetting yourself. If let's say you're moving through an area, and if you're like walking over a bridge or on the top of a building, if you're gonna create an outline, and that's gonna be seen from a long distance away. So you want to avoid like silhouetting yourself. Don't like just walk on the top of a bridge. Try to kneel down, keep a low profile, because the human body is easy to recognize from a long distance, but even if you just crouch down, you can really hide very easily. And then another thing too is sticking to brush. If you stick to brushy areas, it's going to be hard for people to see you, even if they have thermals, even if they have night vision, binoculars. Just like animals, they hide in brushy areas, and there's a good reason for it. And you can learn from them and do the same thing and easily hide from observation that way. So you want to stick to brushy areas. That's the best place to hide yourself and to be stealthy. You want to move at night. You don't want to move in the middle of the day, if possible. If it's an SHTF and you're trying to get home, then you have no choice. And if it's daylight, you have to move through daylight. But If it's in the evening time, you know, or if you have the capability of choosing what time you get to move, and the best time to move is at night, because it's a lot harder for most people to see, you know. And then even with somebody has thermals or night vision, it's going to be hard for them to see through very brushy and dense vegetation. So you can use that to your advantage. The only thing is when you move through vegetation, it makes a ton of noise, especially if it's very thick. So that's something to keep in mind. And then also, you know, when you're walking and if it's dry weather, just be aware that you're going to make a lot more noise. And if it's wet and everything is moist, then, you know, the noise is just not as much. You know, especially if you're moving through a forested area. Wet leaves don't make hardly any noise, so moving around after a rainstorm is the best thing to do. It'll maintain your stealth. And then also, if you're dealing with the winter time, you know, the worst time to move around is like if you have that crusty snow. You know, if let's say you have snow and then there's ice that forms over the top of it, that crusty snow, it makes a lot of noise. You know, versus normal snow is kind of quiet. So be cognizant of the weather conditions and how it affects your stealth. A lot of times too is if you're walking through a forested area, if there's a stream nearby, you can stay along the stream and the noise of the water will drown out your sounds. You know, that's a thing that I learned from hunting deer. You know, I would try to walk along streams because the stream would kind of keep my noise level down. You know, obviously choice of clothing, your colors, and knowing the distinction between gray man and stealth, the two different things. And you know, and being stealthy just means that you're very methodical. You're picking out where you're going. You're not just kind of moving along, you know, randomly in any direction. You're very methodical in how you're moving. You know, you're moving from one area of concealment or cover, and then you're going to another area of concealment, and you're just kind of hopping along and you're trying to move from concealment to other areas of concealment. You're not just running out in the open. And then another thing is to be cognizant of your shadows. You know, especially at nighttime, shadows can be seen. If it's like a strong moon, you know, you can see shadows from far away. So be cognizant of the shadows that you're going to be casting, and try not to cast your shadow into like an open area where it could be easily seen. You know, if it's like a urban environment, you know, you want to avoid trying to cast your shadow into like an open area where, you know, somebody can see it. Or if let's say you're like rounding a turn on a building, and you want to move around the corner of a building, and you know, you don't want your shadow to be thrown on the other side of the building, so this way if somebody's kind of waiting there for you, they can see your shadow before you come. So that's something to be cognizant of. And then you know, trying to think if there's anything else really. You know, and stealth is not just visual and noise, it's also odors. You know, try to keep your odors down. You know, if you're cooking a fire, or if you're using a fire to cook, be aware that somebody could smell that. Be aware that somebody can, you know, see the flame. So, you know, especially smoke can be smelled from a long distance, depending on the wind conditions, depending on the humidity. You know, be aware that humidity does different things to smoke. If it's a very humid day, the smoke will hug the ground. If it's very dry, the smoke will just rise straight up into the air. So, you know, you really don't want to burn a fire if you can help it on a humid day, because it's going to linger around the area and it's going to smell really bad. And then, you know, learn how to use a Dakota fire hole. It's basically just like a trench that you dig in the ground, and that will eliminate a lot of the visual signature of the flames, you know, because it's underground. And then also learn how to cook with a minimal fire. You know, if you have to build a fire to cook or to boil water, if you don't have any purification tablets, you know, use a smaller fire. You don't need to have like a giant inferno, a giant bushcraft fire. Bushcrafting and survival are two separate things. You want to keep your fire small. You don't need a giant fire to boil a quart of water. You don't need a huge fire. You just need a couple of sticks, and just keep feeding sticks, and it'll be enough to boil the water. You don't need a giant campfire. Same thing if you're processing wood for a fire. You don't need to start going crazy and pulling out your bushcrafting saw and hacking away. It's tempting to use all those cool tools, but somebody's gonna hear you. If you're chopping a log with your tomahawk or something, or you're cutting a branch with a saw. All these things make noise, and you need to be cognizant that somebody could be listening, and somebody could potentially jump you and hurt you and attack you. So you can just gather sticks and try to use smaller sources of fuel, and just be aware that there could be people watching you everywhere you go. So you need to really be very stealthy, and I think that stealth is a very overlooked part of prepping. Everybody focuses on the firearms and all the tactical shooting, and doing all the different shooting drills and stuff like that. But stealth is more important, because stealth is going to help you avoid having to use your gun. If you're good at being able to camouflage yourself and staying stealthy, you're not going to have to use your gun at all. And that's the ideal scenario. You don't want to put yourself in positions where you have to deal with conflict, because you don't have unlimited resupply. You may have 30 rounds of ammo, depending on what kind of weapon you're carrying, if you can even get a concealed carry permit. Many places it's not easy to get a concealed carry permit. So you can't just think that you can just walk down the street and shoot everybody that's gonna try to take your stuff or attack you, because that's the wrong approach. The best thing is to lay low, and remain hidden and stay away from trouble. And then your weapon should be a last resort. It shouldn't be you shouldn't feel that because you're carrying a pistol, that you can just walk down the street, and if somebody tries to attack you, you're just going to drop them. That's just going to attract more attention to you from other bad guys in the area, and then it's also going to attract attention of law enforcement, which you don't want. So your goal is to get away from the situation, to get away from the danger zone, to get to your safe area, whatever that is, whether it's your house, whether it's your bug out location. And the best way to do that is to be stealthy. So just think about how you would be stealthy, and what are the things that you can work on to improve your stealth. Another thing I will say is that you need to be in good physical condition to be stealthy. Being stealthy requires a lot of quick movements. It requires good balance. It requires flexibility. So you may have to go into areas that are unconventional. If you have to climb up a fire ladder, to climb up the top of a building to, let's say, shelter up for the night, or you may have to climb through some steep terrain. It helps to be in very good shape, because at that point you're not going to be battling yourself. You're going to be in good enough shape where you can focus on your surroundings and think about your plans and your strategies, and you're not going to be battling your own poor condition. So being in good shape will help you to be stealthier, and it's always good to practice it too. It's good to practice stealth. Even if you go out with your buddies and you play a game of trying to see each other, you can one guy, let's say you have a buddy, you guys can take turns trying to find each other, just like they do in the sniper schools. They have the sniper try to hide, and the instructors try to look for the sniper. You can do something like that. So this way you learn, not just how to hide from someone, but also how to find someone as well, and what to look for. And you really can't do that without practice and experience. You need to know what works in the real world. Just because you see something in a catalog or on a YouTube channel doesn't mean it's going to work in your area or in your, environment. So figure out what works for you, and also understand the concept of breaking up your outline. It doesn't matter what kind of camouflage clothing you have, or even if you have like earthy color clothes, if you have your outline is going to stand out from a long distance away. The human outline, the outline of your body, it looks like a giant blob from long distances, even if you have camouflage. So you may want to consider like augmenting your camouflage with some natural vegetation. You don't have to really go crazy, even just cutting a few branches off some trees and then lashing it to your backpack or to your clothing somehow will assist with breaking up your outline. And like I said, when you decide to use stealth, that means that it's already a really bad situation, and gray man is just not working anymore, or the gray man took you to that point where you need to transition into stealth now. So like I said, the gray man, it gets you 20% of the way, and then you transition from gray man to stealth, and then the stealth will get you the rest of the way home. So stealthiness is, you're going to want to use stealthiness most of your journey, and so that's pretty much it. Just keep in mind, like with the stealthiness, just remember you should always keep in the back of your head that there could be anybody watching you. That's always a good way to think about it. If you're moving through an area, you should always kind of assess the area, assess potential observation points where people could be looking from. Like if you're moving through a city environment, and you see like buildings and stuff like that, you would assume that there may be somebody up in those buildings looking down on the street, which is why I say you should avoid streets at all costs if you can, even if the power is out. But try to look for areas that are obvious observation points where people would be observing from, areas of high ground or high buildings. Those are observation points, and you're going to want to move through those areas as quickly as possible, and definitely move through them at night and not during the day. Stay away from open areas, try to minimize the human outline. If you have to crouching down will break up that human outline, because if you crouch down on the ground, you don't look like a human being. It doesn't stand out, it's not as obvious, because there's no other animal on earth besides people that's straight up on two legs and 6 feet tall. There's no other animal. So to the human eye, if I'm a person and I'm looking for somebody to pass through an area and I'm observing something, I'm going to be looking for that typical thing in my head. It's going to be, okay, it's going to be this tall stick figure, and that's what most people are going to be looking for if they're observing an area. So even if you just kind of bend your head down as you're moving, you kind of bend your head down, or you kind of crouch as you're walking, that kind of makes it harder and less obvious for you to be seen, because the human eye is trained, we're trained to look for that tall stick figure. And so if you just bend your head down and kind of bend down a little, it'll eliminate that stereotypical look of what a person is, and then move through brush like I mentioned, and there's a lot of other things I can go on, but I don't really want to spend too much more time here. It's a whole topic, but I kind of wanted to introduce it and then mention some points, some important points about it, and I hope that you guys take this under consideration in your preps, and when you're putting your bug out bags together, think about how you can be stealthy and what kind of gear you need, and then also practice being stealthy, because practice it'll make a big difference, because you'll see what works in the real world and what doesn't, and things like that. These are things that you won't know until you actually go out there and try it. So that's pretty much it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care. God bless.